The activities available to an inmate cohort must be rotated amongst inmate cohorts in a correctional environment in order to maximize the area available within the electric fence and the secure perimeter. What I mean by this is that the administration can't just let inmates move around a yard willy-nilly because there isn't enough space on the yard to accommodate 1,000 inmates. If everybody on a yard tried to go to the chow hall at the same time, they wouldn't fit in the chow hall, much less all be able to eat in the chow hall. As a result, the administration subdivides the yard into smaller groups, buildings, and tiers, and sections, and even races, so that they'll be able to move groups of inmates more efficiently and provide whatever services they have to with the minimum inconvenience and the minimum lapse in security. This is why so many inmates have stories about them and the same 5 or 6 other guys whenever they were on a yard with over 1,000 other inmates. You would expect them to have a wide list of people they interacted with every day. But in reality, the administration limits the number of people that you interact with, and then prison gang politics further limit the number of people that you'll interact with in a single day. This is why that afternoon, after having my morning with Bull, I was out in the day room playing cards with my downstairs neighbor, John. Vertigo came back from medical, and I was happy for an opportunity to talk with him, so I excused myself from my card game. He sat down with me, and I had a tumbler of coffee that I was drinking. I knew he probably hadn't had the opportunity to drink any because he'd been at medical all morning, and he happily shared mine. Coffee and sharing and these types of things are very common in prison. They help establish a rapport between people, a brothership even. I was putting off discussing the awkward issue that I wanted to raise. You see, he'd asked his friend Bull to show me around the yard, and I'd come to the conclusion that I was uncomfortable around Bull. He'd made a joke, and this is something which makes me uncomfortable. I would honestly have rather just skipped this next couple of videos, but it would be disingenuous at best to not talk about this. Bullet made a joke. He'd said that I looked so good that all the girls must have been chasing me around the world whenever I was out of prison. And then later in the day, whenever he'd offered to spot me while I was doing pull-ups, his body language had been off. It hadn't felt like he was just spotting me. As an adult, it's clear that he was feeling me out, seeing how I would respond to a sexual advance. At the time, I didn't understand this. I just knew that he made me uncomfortable, and I wanted to express this to my friend, Vertigo. As it turned out, he saved me the trouble of finding a way to bring this up. We were sitting at the table talking about our home area, Mendocino County, and it was very cathartic to be able to speak to somebody from my home county. I actually remember thinking that it would have been nice to share a cigarette with him while we were talking, but we weren't allowed to smoke inside at that time. And I guess this tells how long ago this story happened, that there was a rule about smoking at all, that you could smoke, but you couldn't do it inside. Vertigo asked me how I'd feel about moving in with Bull, that he had been asking for a way to get me moved over to C-section near him where there were a lot of whites and a lot of skinheads, and that Bull had volunteered and said that he'd be willing to live with me and the two of them could move over to the section and it would be easier to accomplish. Vertigo wanted to know how I felt about that. I was able to, in the most respectful way possible, express that Bull kind of weirded me out and I didn't want to live with him. Vertigo was immediately concerned, helpful. He said, "You guys having a problem with him? Is everything all right?" And I told him it was nothing like that. It wasn't a real problem. It's just that we didn't rub each other right, that he didn't seem like somebody I wanted to live with. Vertigo dismissed it, said I didn't have to live with anybody I didn't want to, and we moved on to whatever we talked about, and that was the end of that day room, essentially. The next day, I was invited by Vertigo to kind of hang out with the skinheads and do their program out on the yard, which I happily acquiesced to. It gave me some place to be. I was out there and I did the workout with them, and it was not what I would have expected. It was not militant. It wasn't guys in a row doing burpees and screaming cadence at each other. It was a pretty laid-back environment. I did dips and pull-ups, and Vertigo spotted me and helped me with my form and gave me advice on if I wanted to get stronger, here are the things I should do. After a set, Bull came over and smacked me on the back, and he said, "That's a good set, son." And it was weird and awkward, and it didn't seem like an appropriate thing for him to say to me, but it was a little thing, and I just let it go. I ignored it. And then sure enough, just like 2 sets later, again, he smacked me on the back in pretty much the same way and said, "You're really getting it, son." He really inflected the word and raised his voice. It was obvious I was supposed to something. So I commented, and I was as careful as I could to not be rude, because remember, I was literally surrounded by his best friends. But I asked him, I said, hey, Bull, what's up with the son thing, man? You're 10 years older than me, tops. He must have been waiting for a response, because he looked me right in the eye, and a little bit louder than he had to, he said, "Well, I don't call you son because you shine. I call you son because you're mine." And maybe he thought he was being clever, and perhaps in a slightly different environment, this would have went over well. As was, it was immediately awkward and uncomfortable and really tense. And I even noticed the other skinheads kind of slowing down their workouts and looking up, and they were looking at me to see how I responded to this. But I could tell they were looking at him too. It was clear he'd stepped over some line. In short, I had been disrespected. This was not an okay thing for him to have said to me at random like that. So I looked him in the eye, and again, really trying to not be too assertive because of all of his friends that were around me, I asked him, I said, "Bull, that's a weird thing to say, man. I'm a little uncomfortable. What are you saying?" And I guess Bull realized he'd went just a little bit too far, and everyone was looking at him because he laughed and said, "Oh, I'm just joking, man. Don't mind me." And I let it go, of course. I didn't want a problem, and as soon as I did, the tension evaporated. Vertigo came over and kind of stood between us. I felt like he was inserting himself between us. And he said to Bull, "You know, Bull, you're right. We need a handle for Aaron. This dude can't walking around just being called Aaron all day long. But son's a stupid handle. I don't know what you're thinking. Hey, Bull, what do you think we should call him, man?" And I guess this was a routine that they'd done before. Maybe it's something that had been done to Bull, but it was obvious he was rehearsing a script. He'd done this before, and he was comfortable again, because he said, "Oh, no, we can't give Aaron a handle. You earn a handle. How about whenever you can do 20 dips? Then we'll talk about giving him a handle and what he's supposed to be called." This was partially just smoothing out an awkward moment. But it was also a real serious offer, giving me a handle if I hung out and worked out with him for a couple of weeks. You don't need me to tell you this, but a name is important. It identifies you. Whenever you introduce yourself to people, it's the first thing that they know about you, and a handle doubly so. I picked up a couple of handles here and there while I was incarcerated. None of them ever stuck, but I was called Chewbacca because I eventually grew into a pretty big and hairy dude, or later Jewbacca because I grew into a pretty big and hairy dude that wore a yarmulke. But I never introduced myself as any of these things, and so none of them ever really stuck, and eventually I just went back to being Aaron because it's what I was used to and what I was most comfortable with. But at this moment, it was very tempting, the idea of hanging out with these guys, getting a handle, being accepted into a family, as it were. Being accepted into a group is always a very tempting thing, whether it's a new job, a new group of friends, a new school, whatever it might be. Nobody wants to be outcast, isolated, alone. A lot of people have said the worst thing about prison is the isolation, and I can't argue it was awful. But just because you don't want to be alone is no excuse to compromise yourself. If I had compromised myself and assimilated into this group, it's possible that this would be a very different channel that I was running. Perhaps I'd be in prison right now. Perhaps if I was out, I'd be covered in tattoos and talking about the awful mistakes that I made in prison. If you have to choose between assimilating into a group in which you do not belong, which does not reflect your core values, or being alone, I sincerely hope that you will think long and hard before you abandon who you are just to be around people.